Melissa Wolfenbarger was born on September 9, 1977, in the quaint American town of Locust Grove, Georgia. As the youngest child in her family, she was cared for from the very beginning by her older sister, who was 7 years old at the time of Melissa's birth. Throughout their childhood, the sisters developed a strong and close-knit relationship. During high school, Melissa met a young man named Christopher, and shortly after graduating, they married. The couple established their home in a peaceful suburb of Atlanta, where Christopher secured employment at a glass manufacturing facility. Not long after their relocation, Melissa became pregnant, and they welcomed their first daughter, followed by a son a little later. By 1998, at the age of 21, Melissa dedicated most of her time to raising her children. Despite her youth, she found joy in her expanding family. Melissa made an effort to visit her parents and sister whenever possible, but due to the distance and her numerous responsibilities, these visits were infrequent. They had planned to celebrate Christmas with her family that year, and a month prior, during Thanksgiving, Melissa reached out to her mother to request a special gift, an old photograph of her grandfather. Her mother diligently searched through family albums, found the perfect picture, and eagerly awaited the arrival of her daughter and grandchildren. However, when Christmas arrived, Melissa did not appear. Initially, her parents were surprised, as they had been planning this gathering for over a month, but they assumed she might simply be overwhelmed with her 2 young children and her recent job at a cafe, as Christopher's income was insufficient to support the entire family. The situation was further complicated by their inability to make a phone call. Melissa's parents were concerned about her absence and decided to inquire why she had not been in contact. At that time, there was no telephone in her home, and cell phones were not widely used. Typically, Melissa would call from her in-law's residence, but since her last communication on Thanksgiving, she had not reached out. Her parents initially chose to wait, but when Melissa failed to call on her mother's birthday, their worry intensified, prompting them to travel to Atlanta to check on her. Upon arrival, they were met with an unexpected revelation. Melissa and Christopher's house was entirely vacant. Conversations with the neighbors revealed that the family had moved out shortly after Christmas, yet no one knew their destination. This left her parents bewildered, as they could not fathom that Melissa would relocate without informing them. Eventually, they managed to contact Christopher's parents, who facilitated communication with him. However, the situation grew even more perplexing when Christopher claimed that Melissa had left him in December and had not been seen since. He asserted that she had chosen to relocate to California to start anew, leaving him and their young children behind. Her parents found Christopher's account difficult to accept. They could not believe that Melissa would abandon her children, aged 1 and 2. Furthermore, they were convinced that if she had truly decided to move, she would have reached out or visited them at some point, which had not occurred. Despite their skepticism, Christopher remained steadfast in his narrative, and Melissa's parents were unable to extract any further information from him. They returned home, uncertain of their next steps, but resolute in their determination to locate their daughter. In the months that followed, efforts were made to locate her by reaching out to friends and family, yet it seemed as though Mela had completely disappeared. In the spring of 1999, Melissa's mother came across a news report detailing the discovery of a human head in a bag soaked in bleach by the Atlanta police in a wooded area. Shortly thereafter, 4 additional bags containing other body parts were found. What particularly alarmed her was the proximity of the site to Christopher's former workplace, leading her to fear that the remains might belong to her daughter. However, the police later confirmed that the head was identified as belonging to a missing man from an unrelated cold case. By early 2000, Melissa's parents resolved to involve law enforcement, but this did not yield significant results. Investigators interviewed Christopher, and concluded that Melissa had likely chosen to leave her family to start anew, which explained her lack of communication. Consequently, the police did not actively pursue the case. Nevertheless, Melissa's parents remained unconvinced that she had simply abandoned her previous life. With each passing month, their belief that something sinister had occurred only intensified, and they grew increasingly suspicious of Christopher's involvement. They were aware of the couple's tumultuous relationship, marked by instances of physical abuse from Christopher towards Melissa, which had prompted her to leave him and seek refuge with her parents, taking the children with her. Despite his previous apologies and attempts to reconcile, Christopher's lack of action this time raised further doubts. If he had previously exerted every effort to win her back, why had he not taken any steps to do so now? He did not contact her parents, did not approach the police, and made no attempt to prevent her departure. An additional peculiar aspect was that, according to Christopher, Melissa had not taken any belongings with her: no clothing, no jewelry, and not even her identification documents. This situation appeared exceedingly unusual, yet without assistance from law enforcement, Melissa's parents felt utterly helpless to take any action. For several years, there was still no trace of Melissa. However, in 2003, a significant turn of events occurred in the most astonishing manner. The police were revisiting the murder case of a woman from 1977, which had remained unsolved for 26 years. The case was reopened after a review of the evidence and the execution of a DNA test, which led detectives to identify the perpetrator, Carl Patton, Melissa's father. This revelation was merely the beginning. Following his arrest, Carl proposed a deal to the authorities, agreeing to confess to 3 additional murders in exchange for full immunity for his wife, who had assisted him in these crimes. As part of this arrangement, Melissa's mother consented to testify against her husband and ultimately received immunity. According to their confessions, in December 1977, a woman named Mary, who was acquainted with Carl, offered him $155,000 to murder her husband due to his infidelity. Additionally, Mary had taken out a life insurance policy on him and intended to benefit financially from his death. Carl accepted the offer and enlisted a friend to help execute the murder. However, when they approached the husband, they found his lover with him, prompting them to decide to eliminate her as well. They disposed of the woman's body in a river and left the man's body in his car on train tracks, attempting to stage it as an accident. A month later, Carl informed his wife that his accomplice had seemingly revealed details about the crime to others. Carl, who had previously been in a relationship, felt compelled to care for his girlfriend and her partner. He invited the couple to his residence, where he ultimately murdered them. With the assistance of his wife, he disposed of their bodies by casting them into a river. She also aided him in cleaning the crime scene and the vehicle used for transporting the remains. Subsequently, Carl admitted to a 5th murder that had occurred 5 years prior, in which Mary had again offered him money, this time to eliminate her first husband. Carl acquiesced to her request. Consequently, he faced charges for 5 murders, and the authorities began to suspect him in the case of his daughter Melissa's disappearance. However, Carl maintained that he would never harm his daughter and had no involvement in her case. Following a thorough investigation, detectives determined that Carl was likely truthful in his assertions. Initially, they had only linked him to 1 murder, but he voluntarily confessed to 4 additional ones. Carl expressed profound remorse for his actions, which he claimed motivated his confessions. In a surprising turn, he requested a meeting with the lead detective who had connected him to the murders, suggesting that since the detective had successfully apprehended him, perhaps he could assist in locating his daughter. The detective found this request intriguing. Here was a man responsible for 5 murders, now seeking help in finding his missing child. The detective agreed to investigate further, reviewing the scant details surrounding Melissa's disappearance. He soon identified a significant detail: the bags of human remains discovered near Christopher's workplace 4 years earlier. Authorities initially believed the remains belonged to a male. However, the detective realized that this conclusion was not supported by forensic evidence, but rather was a mere assumption. Given the advanced state of decomposition of the remains, he opted for a re-examination and requested a DNA test, as he already had Carl's DNA on record. The results confirmed his suspicions. The remains were not those of a man, but belonged to Melissa. This significant development led the police to determine that Melissa had been deceased for several years, rather than merely missing, prompting a reclassification of her case as a homicide. According to the medical examiner's report, the victim's body had been dismembered with a reciprocating electric saw, and notably, Melissa's torso was never recovered. Despite extensive searches in the wooded area where the other remains were found, it remained elusive. Investigators did, however, uncover a promising lead as they delved into Christopher's background, interviewing his former employer at the glass factory, where he had been employed until Melissa's disappearance. It was revealed that Christopher had been terminated around the same time for allegedly stealing an electric saw of the same model used in the dismemberment of Melissa's body. Additionally, Melissa's mother informed the police of Christopher's history of physical abuse towards her daughter, and he also had a criminal record. Another concerning detail was Christopher's name change shortly after Melissa's death, which lacked a clear justification. All these factors positioned Christopher as the primary suspect in her murder. The police lacked substantial evidence against him, despite conducting multiple interviews where he consistently maintained his initial account, albeit with frequent alterations to specific details. During one discussion, Christopher alleged that Melissa had a romantic partner and had eloped with him. In another instance, he suggested that she intended to sell counterfeit identification, which he claimed explained her lack of communication. Additionally, investigators discovered that shortly after relocating from their residence, Christopher had left his children in the care of his parents and had since played a minimal role in their upbringing. Although he occasionally visited them, the children were largely unaware of his identity as their father. Unfortunately, none of this information advanced the investigation towards an arrest, as the authorities required concrete evidence. They secured a warrant to search the residence where Melissa had lived prior to her death, suspecting that the murder, which involved the use of an electric saw, had occurred there. Detectives hoped to uncover blood evidence or other pertinent clues. Forensic specialists conducted a thorough examination of the premises, collecting samples from various surfaces. Regrettably, their analysis did not yield any significant findings, as the forensic technology available at the time was considerably less sophisticated than it is today. Consequently, the collected materials were stored in the evidence warehouse, with the hope that they might eventually prove valuable. The detectives made several additional attempts to uncover new leads and encourage Christopher to divulge more information, but each effort was unsuccessful, leading the case to grow cold once more for many years. Meanwhile, Melissa's father faced conviction for unrelated charges. Sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms, along with an additional 20 years in prison, it is important to highlight that Mary, the woman who had financially supported him in 2 of the murders, had passed away in the late 1980s, thus evading any repercussions for her involvement. Meanwhile, Melissa's mother and her elder sister persistently endeavored to advance the investigation independently. They made efforts to keep the case in the public eye and maintained regular communication with the detectives. However, their initiatives did not result in any significant developments. This situation persisted until 2017, during which Melissa's mother remained hopeful of achieving justice for her daughter. That year, she chose to participate in an event where true crime enthusiasts convened to discuss cold cases and explore potential new leads. Among the attendees was a crime analyst named Cheryl McCollum, to whom Melissa's mother sought assistance. She recounted the circumstances surrounding her daughter's disappearance and revealed a startling detail that took Cheryl by surprise. The woman confessed that her husband had committed 5 murders and that she had aided him. Cheryl became captivated by the case and, following the event, began an in-depth investigation. She engaged with Melissa's family and maintained communication with her father, who was incarcerated. What particularly struck Cheryl was the fact that a man responsible for 5 murders appeared more troubled by the possibility that his daughter's case would remain unresolved. Over the subsequent years, Cheryl amassed all pertinent information regarding the case and ultimately identified Melissa's husband, Christopher, as the most likely suspect. Although there was no direct evidence implicating him, the sheer volume of circumstantial evidence was compelling. The evidence strongly indicated that he had a history of domestic violence against Melissa, and he made no attempts to locate her after her disappearance, instead choosing to continue his life as if nothing had occurred. The most damning detail was that shortly before Melissa's death, Christopher had been accused by his employer of stealing the very type of saw that was used to dismember her body. Melissa's family, including her children, had no doubts regarding Christopher's culpability. By the time Cheryl took an interest in the case, the children had matured and sought to assist her in solving it. Cheryl also reached out to notable figures in the true crime community, including journalist Nancy Grace and various law enforcement officials. After reviewing the materials she had compiled, they all concurred that Christopher was the prime suspect. However, there was no conclusive evidence against him, leaving the case unresolved. At this juncture, Nancy Grace recommended that Cheryl create her own podcast to garner more attention for the case, as publicity can often play a pivotal role in unsolved investigations by potentially attracting new witnesses who may not recognize the importance of their information. Ultimately, Cheryl decided to proceed with the podcast, releasing the first episode concerning Melissa's case in 2023. Since then, she has produced numerous episodes featuring the victim's mother and other family members. Despite presenting all the information she had accumulated over the years, there remained no advancement in the case until April 2024, when the long-awaited developments occurred. A long-anticipated development in the case occurred following the release of another podcast episode. A witness contacted Cheryl, indicating that he had come across the podcast and possessed potentially significant information. He recounted having observed a heated argument between Melissa and Christopher shortly before her disappearance. The specifics of his testimony remain undisclosed, as the incident transpired only a few months prior, and detectives opted to keep this information confidential to protect the integrity of the investigation. According to various sources, it has been suggested that during this altercation, Christopher allegedly made threats against Melissa. Cheryl relayed this account to the authorities, marking a pivotal moment that led investigators to reopen the case. Over the subsequent 3 months, law enforcement meticulously reviewed the case files, interviewed all relevant parties, and analyzed the evidence with the aid of contemporary technology. Experts scrutinized the bags containing the remains, as well as various samples collected from the residence of Christopher and Melissa, where the murder is believed to have occurred. The decision to withhold certain details is a common practice, as the availability of information prior to the trial can significantly impact the case's outcome. The defense may leverage this situation to their benefit and seek ways to contest the existing evidence. Currently, Christopher is incarcerated, awaiting trial and a preliminary hearing, during which he will enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty. Melissa's family harbors little doubt regarding his ability to escape justice, a sentiment echoed by the investigators, who appear to have uncovered substantial evidence that will be exceedingly challenging to refute. At this juncture, the case is nearing its resolution, despite the fact that nearly 26 years have elapsed. Melissa's narrative has resonated nationwide due to its truly remarkable details. Initially, law enforcement confirmed the victim's death only after her father was apprehended for 5 murders and solicited assistance from investigators. Subsequently, a podcast played a pivotal role in drawing forth a witness whose testimony prompted the reopening of the investigation and ultimately led to Christopher's arrest. Melissa's children also maintain their belief in their father's guilt and are eager for justice to be served. In addition to awaiting a guilty verdict, they seek to uncover the complete truth and understand Christopher's motives, which can only be achieved if he chooses to confess. Please share your thoughts on this narrative in the comments section, and if you found my video enjoyable, kindly press the like button. Thank you for watching.